Hi, I'm Rachelle Mee-Chapman, and this is Relig-ish, where we create right-fit spiritual practices for a post-church world. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about rituals for grief, loss, and mourning in our post-church culture. You know, in the wake of the Boston Marathon bombings and the terrible news week that was last week with the fertilizer plant explosion, the earthquake in China, flooding in the Midwest, and any other number of local and global tragedies, I've really been thinking a lot this past week about how do we mourn? What are our rituals for grief and mourning? I remember when I first graduated from seminary, one of my friends went into a more traditional role and became a pastor of an Anglican church. And it was an older population in the congregation, and so the first few months of his residency there, he was called upon to do a number of funerals for people that he didn't know or barely knew. And I remember him saying, I've never been so grateful for the liturgy, because there is an established liturgy for funerals in the Anglican Church, a set of readings and prayers and symbolic practices that allow us to grieve and to mourn, to remember and to celebrate. And these practices, this liturgy, puts it all into a context that helps us to process grief and understand the role of death in the face of life. But when we live in a post-church culture, we no longer have that liturgical resource to turn to. And even if we did return to it, it might not be that supportive for us in a time of grief because it's not in alignment with our beliefs and values, perhaps, anymore. So we're sort of at a loss because the 24-hour news cycle is exposing us more and more to stories of grief and tragedy, more than what we would know of if we just were in our little local sphere. And yet we don't have any liturgy or resource for expressing the emotional impact, the spiritual impact, the psychological impact of being aware of all of that death. Or do we? Because this last week I've sort of put on my anthropologist glasses and I've tried to look at my own culture as an anthropologist and just observe what rituals do we have for grief and mourning in our post-church world. And I've noticed that there are 4 ways that every time there's a big national or international tragedy, we turn to these 4 rituals to help us process what's going on. The first thing we do in a post-church world in times of grief and loss is we turn to song. Almost immediately after the Boston bombings, the contestant on American Idol who's from Boston, Angie Miller, sang the song "I'll Stand By You" on the television show and dedicated it to her hometown. Now, it can be easy to dismiss this as, being opportunistic or being too showy, but we've seen over and over again in times of local or global tragedy that we turn to our rock stars and our musical artists to help us express solidarity, to help us express compassion, and to help us get through these terrible tragedies. So if you think about, We Are the World back during the Ethiopian famine, or the way that U2 performed at the Super Bowl after 9/11, those songs moved us to act and gave us a way to express our emotions around the loss. So that's one, in our sort of deconstructed liturgy for funeral services, turning to song is one of the rituals that we have in our modern culture. The second thing I've noticed is that we like to turn to story. I remember growing up, it was very popular to have these sitcoms, like Blossom was one of them, and every once in a while when something big happened or when there was some big issue of the day, they would have a very special episode of Blossom, and they would talk about drunk driving, or, now maybe it would be an episode about not texting while you drive. But this very special episode phenomenon, while we, again, can make fun of it because it's on television and television is silly, or is it? It is a way that we engage our imagination and a way that we put our story in context of this larger global story. So, for instance, after 9/11, the show West Wing did a very special episode. It was called Episode 0. It was right at the beginning of the 3rd season, and it was entitled Isaac and Ishmael, in which they used their storytelling platform to remind people that Islam is not synonymous with Islamic extremism. And it was a very powerful episode that in which the White House staffers were teaching this group of students about tolerance and kind of expanding the scope of their understanding of the Islamic world. And it did that also for all of the viewers. So this very special episode is a way that we use story as a ritual and as a rite to process these tragedies in our world. The third thing that we do as a culture is we grab onto image. And we create images that help us remember and mourn. And that is what you see in these sort of roadside memorials that pop up whenever there's a great tragedy. Stacks of running shoes at the Boston Marathon, flowers and crosses on the twisty, turny corners of the roads where accidents cause loss of life, stuffed animals set out in front of the school in Newtown. And in this way, we create a symbol to remember those who are lost. And by all of us adding to that symbol and creating this great mound of stuff, we show that there is this surge of compassion and support for the families that are experiencing loss. So it becomes a visual symbol that reminds our brains, our hearts, and our spirits that we are not alone, that we are united, and that memory will not be forgotten. And the fourth thing that we do in times of tragedy, it's a little less about memorializing and it's a little bit more about healing, is that we raise money. In times of famine, in times of loss of life, in times of violence, in times of great epidemic illness, we turn to the telethon and the fundraiser and the memorial fund, and we give money. Now, a lot of people, again, will poo-poo this as like just trying to put a Band-Aid on something. But what we are actually doing is trying to staunch the flow of blood, right? We are trying to help people pay for their medical bills. We're trying to provide housing after a great hurricane. We're trying to bring comfort to children whose parents have been lost by, sending them on vacation with their grandparent or whatever it is. We're trying to bring healing through this vehicle of money. Now, would it be more touching if we lived in close-knit communities where we could just actually turn to that family and instead of just writing a check, bring them a holiday meal, repair the hole in their roof, pay for their medical bills? Yes, that would be more relational and it would be lovely. But we don't live in that kind of culture. And so our solution is to do these fundraising events as part of our mourning and healing process. So if you're living outside of a religious institution and you're feeling a call to have some sort of ritual to memorialize the loss, to remember those who are gone, and to express sorrow and to step into healing, these are some of the things that we use in our culture: song and story, image, and the giving of funds. So even though you might live in a post-church culture and you might not have an official liturgy for mourning, there are rites and rituals that have been adapted by that culture that can help you remember those who are lost, express your grief and sorrow, and begin to step into healing through song and through story, through image, and through the giving and sharing of wealth. I always have this tagline at the end of each episode that encourages you to live in a Relig-ish way. And I think this week, in the face of so much loss, it's more important than ever. So as you step into your rest of your day and the rest of your week, I hope that you will remember to get curious about the other, to trust your gut, and to always, always live from a place of love. Amen. Amen.